The Canon R5 has been an enormous success for Canon. It was a rough start at first with the whole heat thing, but they eventually got it figured out. And now, 3 years on, it's still an amazingly solid, very competitive platform, even against the latest and greatest from other firms. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The relevance of the R5 going forward is complicated, especially compared to the newer offerings from Sony. So now, with all the chatter about the R5 redesign flying around, let's talk about what the R5 Mark II could have and what it should have, and maybe also what it shouldn't have. My name is Brian Roberts. Welcome to Loud&Clear. Before me here, I have the latest iteration of the R5 platform, the R5C. It's a strange camera in a lot of ways, brilliant and maddening at the same time. At first blush, the camera 1000% looked like a rush-to-market fix for the OG's heat thing, right? However, right after this camera was released, Canon fixed the R5 overheating via firmware updates. So does that mean the 50-50 creamsicle of a camera, that is the R5C, is a foretelling of what a redesigned R5 might also have? Well, let's talk about that, because as ergonomics go, there are some takeaways from comparing the two. The R5 is obviously smaller, as it doesn't have this fan on back. But honestly, having an R5 at the same time as I did the R5C, you don't notice a difference in size. The two cameras handle near as makes no difference, exactly the same. What that fan does make a difference though, and this you do notice, is in power consumption. While it's no secret that the R5C has abysmal battery life, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are other actively cooled compact cameras out there like the Sony FX3 that get much better, much longer battery life. Let's go even a bit deeper on this though, because the fan isn't actually the problem, but rather it's showing us what the real problems are. Case in point, I was running an OG R5 with a battery grip side by side with a Sony Alpha 1, it also having a battery grip. I was consistently getting about twice the battery life out of the Sony versus the Canon while shooting stills. Now, these are two cameras that are very similar resolution, similar sensor size, similar feature set, etc. However, the Sony has two things that are crucial for the R5 Mark II to also have, and those are a more efficient processor and a more efficient battery architecture. The next R5 needs these things. The Digit 10 processor, which is the one on the current R5s and pretty much everything else Canon has, I'm told is basically a pair of Digit 8s bonded together, which means in broad strokes it's based on ARM technology that's almost a decade old. It was great for the day and Canon has gotten some great longevity from it, but they need to keep up with the competition, and by upgrading the Digit 10, Canon has an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, as the efficiency will matter both for battery life and for thermals, perhaps enabling more raw recording capabilities without a fan. Now, onto the battery. The Canon LPE6, in its current design, the LPE6NH version, isn't bad, but it's also not as good as the Sony Z battery. Now, in fairness, this is a tough one to call, even though its behavior is what it is. What we don't know is if the decreased runtime between a gripped R5 and a gripped A1 is because of the battery, the processor, the OS, or the Wi-Fi Bluetooth radios as it pertains to wirelessly tethering. But whatever it is, the Sony system seems to perform better than the Canons in that regard. So efficiency and battery is needed to be better on the R5 Mark II. While we're on the subject of tethering though, this is also an important thing to bring up. The Canon Connect app is the worst camera app I've used in the past few years. The best is unquestionably Red's control app for Komodo. It's mind-blowingly good, the Red one is, and should serve as a model for all camera apps going forward. So why is Canon's app so poor? Well, there are a couple reasons, but before I get to that, let me say that there are some things Canon is doing well with their app. The connection is easy and stable, the range is good, some of the tools like the focus assist tool are pretty handy. However, compared to the competing app from Sony, there are some deficiencies. Now, this isn't meant to be a deep dive into the control apps, but I'll give you the biggest two things the Sony does much better, which in my process allows me to work about twice as quickly with the Sony as I can the Canon. First of all, the Canon Camera Connect app, I'm told, was designed for a phone, not an iPad. Everyone I know who's tethering, we're all doing it on tablets, not on phones. And in fairness, I don't know what the live view resolution on this app is, but when you blow up a phone app to a tablet, it looks soft, pixelated, just out of focus in general. Secondly, and this is something Sony used to do poorly as well, but they fixed it, with the Canon app, you need to wait until the image preview downloads to the device before you can modify your settings to then fire your next frame. This is a big deal when you have workflows like I do, where you're compositing stills and doing brackets and such. Let me show you. Okay, so this is what I was talking about with the Sony app versus the Canon app. So we are shooting this big fancy house today, fancy view, and I have both the A7R Mark V, and over there is the Canon R5C here, because we're doing photo and video today. But I want to show you the difference between the control apps. And so let's have the A7R5 is what we have set up right now. And this is the native Sony Imaging Edge control app. So what I'm going to do for this shot is I'm going to bracket my ambient exposures and go, I don't know, 3 or 4 stops maybe, and then also do a flash exposure so I can get my clear window view out there. So let me show you how well this works with the Sony. So I am right now at 0.4 f9, ISO 100, everything is on manual focus, manual white balance. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it's auto white balance on that, but let me show you how fast this takes to bracket. So there's one, and I'm going to go 1 stop, 2 stops, we'll do 3 stops. Let's bump up our ISO a little bit, and that's good for my windows. Turn my flash trigger on, boom, flash, okay? So now, there's my flash shot, and here is my bracketed exposures, okay? So very, very simple with the Sony app. And the good thing is, all right, let me go back to some ambient type of shots here. So as you'll see, when I take an exposure, and then I go and I take an exposure, and then I go and I take an exposure, I can be doing that very quickly, even as the images are coming into the iPad to preview. I can be doing all that very quickly. So that's very different from the Canon app, and I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, so here we are now with the Canon app, and sorry, this big industrial refrigerator here is making a bunch of noise. Similar settings as the Sony app. Now, a couple things that I do like about the Canon app better is I can, even on manual focus here, so I can poke on the screen and then use the focus tool on the screen on the camera there to see if I'm in focus. But I digress. I'm going to do the same exact thing now with the Canon Connect app as I just did with the Sony Imaging Edge app on the A7R5. So I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to bracket 3 or 4 exposures. And then I'm actually not going to do a flash shot. I don't have a flash trigger on here. I'm just doing this for the sake of the example of showing the app here. And what you'll see though is it takes a lot longer for that camera to transfer to here. But the big difference is I cannot modify and adjust my settings as that file is coming over. And so where I was going boom, adjust, boom, adjust, boom, adjust on the Sony, I cannot do that on the Canon. So I'll do it as fast as I can. Okay, now I'm going down. Oh, didn't take. Oh, didn't take. Oh, now it goes. See, I have to wait for the preview to come over. There it goes. Before, didn't take, there it goes. And so now the images, okay, now that the images are are there. The images look okay. You know, and I would have a flash shot in there too. And, you know, here's the thing. It's somebody will say, oh, well, you know, that's not a big deal. It only takes a couple more seconds every time. But if you have a house like this one, okay, this is a 3,500 square foot house. It's a couple $1 million, and I'm taking a lot of images of it. It really ends up starting to make a big difference in workflow. And if you figure I shoot hundreds of homes per year, that ends up being a lot of time. So the other thing that the Canon app needs to get better is, I don't know how well this is going to translate in the GoPro I'm wearing on my forehead here. This image looks pretty good as far as like the resolution of the image and such, because this is actually the image on the camera. But if we go back to the preview, let me raise the exposure here a bit. If we go back to the preview of this image, this is just not of high resolution. It looks like it's out of focus, even though I know that it's in focus because I'm at f9 and I am focused on that wall plate. So everything is pretty much in focus. I'll go over to this plant here and see it's still in focus. So, but it looks like it's out of focus because this Canon app was developed for a phone, not an iPad. So you blow it up, and that's kind of a tough way to work to make it seem like you're all out of focus all the time. Okay, so the battery and processor are the first things that need to be better with the R5 Mark II, and the tethering is the third thing. I have a couple more, and for this we need to go back to the R5C. Josh Satin made a great video a couple weeks ago in which he did a deep dive comparing dynamic range between Canon cameras, and I'll leave a link to it down there. Josh's conclusion was that the Canon needs a new log curve because the modern Canon sensors can resolve more dynamic range than is able to be captured in the C-Log3 gamma that most Canon cameras, including the R5, can capture. This actually can be seen pretty clearly when shooting internal RAW and then interpreting it into C-Log2 in your NLE. You do get more dynamic range, albeit at the expense of shadow noise. Now for work like what I do, interiors, that extra stop of latitude and the highlights is clutch, as I'm now better able to resolve what is outside of windows instead of it just being blown to smithereens. So would a new log curve unlock these sensors? Maybe, but I'd settle for C-Log2 being available in camera for the 10-bit codecs because I can make use of that middle gray shift upwards regardless of if the total dynamic range is greater or not. But I said the R5C has something to do with this too, and that is this. The R5C allegedly has the same sensor and same processor as the OG R5. However, regardless of which codec you shoot either camera in, all the way up to 8K RAW, the R5C has a noticeable amount of dynamic range greater than the OG R5. Everybody who has both cameras has seen this, but Canon has remained silent about it. At first we figured, well, maybe it's because of the XAVC modes in the R5C, or because more of its 4K frame rates and modes are downscaled from the 8K capture, allowing you to also downscale noise, but like I said, it's in RAW as well, so I'm going to leave this point open because Canon continues to tune this camera. In fact, just a couple days ago as of this recording, new firmware was released for most Canon cameras, including both the R5 and the R5C. And probably the most interesting change was with the R5C, which has now post-firmware gained Netflix approval, allegedly because it now has a better image in XAVC. What that means, we don't really know because Canon hasn't defined it further, and like I said, it happened just a couple days ago, so no one has really worked or tested extensively with it yet, but it's really interesting that Canon can continue to squeeze more quality out of a now 3-year-old sensor. So number 4, the new R5 needs to have faster shutter and or faster read speed as it relates to maximum flash sync. Canon has several RF cameras on the market, and the R5 variants are the highest resolution ones. What that means is that there are a lot of users like me buying these things. That's to say, commercial photographers of all different disciplines. We know that we need the resolution, we know why we need the resolution, and another thing a ton of us do is work with strobes. Product, fashion, interiors, we're using lights. Sony's current flagship, the Alpha 1, which has been my daily driver for a couple years, That is due almost exclusively to one spec that anyone who works with lights will drool over: maximum flash sync speed, which on the A1 is 1/400th of a second. On pretty much every other, even flagship, is 1/250th or slower. If you don't know why that's so important, then I made a video a while back showing you the technique about the 1/400th flash sync strobe shot to be able to balance ambient light. So I'll leave a link to it right wherever the card goes right there. But if Canon is going to be competitive, they need to quicken that curtain and probably need to stack the sensor as well. As long as we're talking about exposure here, there's one thing that every Canon camera lacks, which drives me absolutely crazy. The reason it drives me crazy is because it's already in there. And I'm talking about zebras, specifically the ability to use zebras, not just for video, but for stills as well. Those of you who have been around the channel a while have probably heard me harp on this before, because it's really a thing. Seeing and be able to see and set where your point of no highlight return is in real time as you're shooting is huge. And I have no idea why Canon limits the implementation of that tool to its video capture alone. I know this may not sound like a big deal to some of you, but let me tell you, when you've used cameras that can do this, there's no going back. You feel like you're flying blind without it. So there they are, my must-haves in an R5 Mark II. More efficient processor, better battery, better control app, higher maximum flash sync, and zebras in stills mode. And you know what? These are all reasonable things that would straight up just make the camera better. For instance, I for a few years shot on the Sony A7 R4, which is a lovely camera as far as image quality goes, but it was a bear to work with. Everything was slow, heavy files, and just unstable. Recently I bought, and I've been working with the new Sony A7 R5. Same sensor as the A7 R4, but the camera is a world better now. It has the A1's processor, it has dual CF Express Type A card architecture on board, a better EVF, a better screen. Everything is better, even though it's built around a now old sensor. You see, because the sensor was never the problem to begin with the A7 R4, everything else was. Same thing with the R5. It's a great camera. We don't need a new R5. We need this one to be tweaked and reworked like Sony did with their high-resolution bodies. There are, however, things I think it shouldn't have. Number one, more resolution. Look, I know that megapixels gets all the hype, but really it's not nearly as important as any of these other things. At some point, your pixel pitch on any given sensor becomes so dense that signal-to-noise ratio takes a beating. Case in point, even though the Sony A7 R5's 61 megapixel sensor is backside illuminated and the Canon R5 variants are not, the Canons have cleaner shadows and more pleasing, less chroma-y noise patterns. It's just physics. The Sonys have, 30-35% more resolution on the same size sensor. It's noisy. Personally, I think anything over about 50 megapixel ideally should have a bigger sensor in front of it, i.e. medium format, that's better able to resolve available light. You can fight me in the comments, but I truly do think the 45 megapixel R5 is quite possibly the world's most perfect current full frame resolution. Much lower than that, you do lose the ability to crop heavily, and above that causes all sorts of other problems. And I think Canon is smart enough to realize this, but we'll see. The only other thing the OG R5 does really wrong that the redesign needs to stay away from is nothing. It's brilliant, especially in the R5C form. There are 100 other things I'd rather see it do, sure, but I've just outlined the important ones. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are you looking forward to the R5 Mark II? What kind of work do you do? And what is the R5 lacking that you would like to see resolved in the next version? And as always, hit that like button, subscribe, all the YouTuber stuff, and I'll see you again soon. Peace.